Hey, welcome back to the Mormon News Roundup. I am your host, Dives. That is talent on loan from Kolob. This is a special episode of Real Talk Mormonism, and I'm joined by Exmo Joe of the Hellfire Agency. Joe, how's it going?
Going great, man. It's another day where Tim Ballard's on the loose, so he's still out there making content for the Hellfire Agency. Keep going, Timmy boy.
Yeah, I guess you and Nuance Ho are kind of big on following that. You're following her podcast, right?
I sure am. Oh yeah, now it's the Cara Burrell. It used to be Nuance Ho, now she's the Cara Burrell podcast, who's stepping up on the professionalism. But really, it's become the Ryan Fisher show lately. I don't know if you've seen that, but it's been quite interesting to see how this ex-Mormon apologist has really come clean about not only Tim Ballard, but frankly about the whole church in general.
Yeah, I haven't been following her podcast. I watched some of it. We've covered some of it on the Mormon News Roundup, but definitely not all of it. But before we get into this, Joe, who are you? What are you all about? And what is your Mormon story?
Yeah, so I am an ex-Mormon atheist. I am a podcaster these days, but by training, I'm a filmmaker and worked in video production most of my life. I am the author of The Korihor Argument, A Missionary's Journey Out of Mormonism. And more than anything else, I'm a guy who talks a lot about, hey, look at that. You found a copy. I'm a guy who talks about how atheism is really maligned by believers for reasons that really it doesn't deserve, considering that, as Sam Harris, perhaps the most notorious atheist in the world, has said, atheism has no content. So, so I'm probably the last holdout, I think, of ex-Mormon atheists who's willing to stand on this corner with atheism to say, would you like to learn about nothing? There's nothing here.
Very amusing. Now, I very first came to your attention here. I saw that you were on the you were on Mormon Book Reviews here with Steve Pinecker. What were you talking about with him over there on Mormon Book Reviews?
Well, it was supposed to be about me taking on what you're taking on, which was that I've been trying to goad Jacob Hansen of Thoughtful Faith into debating me for a long time. But I don't know if he doesn't read his comments, or I think he sent an email to somebody at some point, or now I've thrown down the gauntlet on the channel. He's probably not going to watch either. I'll do it again. If Jacob Hansen wants to debate an ex-Mormon atheist, I'm your Huckleberry.
Very interesting stuff. We're going to talk about debating here in a second, because I do understand that you were debating there with one certain other Jacob Isbell, on polygamy. What was the that debate all about there? That was on the Love Unfiltered Rise podcast. What was that?
Yeah, Heidi Love is the host there. She's great. The Unfiltered Rise is a podcast about conspiracy theories, and I don't jump for a conspiracy theory, but I have to say, when my ex-Mormon friend Heidi Love contacted me to say, will you come on my conspiracy theory show? And I'm like, what am I? I'm like, are we going to fight? And she's like, no, we're not going to fight. I'm like, oh, aren't you like a Trump person or like a? She's like, no. I'm like, oh, okay. And I said, what do you want me to talk about? She's like, talk about Tim Ballard, talk about Ted Bundy, talk about the church. And I'm like, let's go. So yeah. Anyways, she has had Jacob Isbell on, and Jacob Isbell has debated with many people throughout the years. He's a pneumo who believes that Joseph Smith was never a polygamist, and believes he can make a good case for it. And he had, I call it the Jacobing. He and Jacob Isbell, Jacob Hansen, went on their program, on Jacob Hansen's program, and they Jacobed back and forth, and they Jacobed hard. And they both made some, to be honest with you, Jacob Hansen made a fairly, straightforward case for why Joseph Smith definitely was a polygamist. But then they came to the conclusion that, at one point, Jacob brings up the Nauvoo Expositor, which for me is knockdown evidence. I mean, there it is. The Nauvoo Expositor, where ex-Mormons exposed that Joseph Smith had been hitting on women, proposing to women, and so forth. And Jacob had answered him and said, well, wait a minute. Oh, was it on Stephen Planker's song? Oh, I feel bad now. But Stephen's great, by the way. I'm sure you know him. He's a mensch. I love the guy. But they both concluded, or Jacob had proposed, is like, are we going to take the word of people who are critics of the church? And I'm like, wait a second. Yes. I mean, you don't have to take it as gospel, but to not take it at all is to perhaps failed to learn the most important things about it. You know, historians refer to that as critical historiography, learning about a group of people on the basis of what is said by their competitors, because some things you can't learn from people's own apologetics. You can't learn from the way that any group of people describes themselves in history, especially. So, I mean, why wouldn't you at least consider? I mean, look, you can look at a bunch of scholarship that goes into the history of people who said things about the church that turned out not to be true, like William E. McClellan, or like Fawn Brodie apparently made some mistakes in No Man Knows My History. And, you know, there's all these kinds of things. Okay, fine. Critics of the church will make mistakes, but to say that means that we're not going to take any firsthand account, any affidavits, which there were 3 sworn affidavits published at the front of the Nauvoo Expositor, and say, oh yeah, these people, they just swear affidavits willy-nilly, and they're, you know, we're not going to consider anything that they say. I have to push back on. So I had challenged Jacob Isbell to a debate and said, look, let's just debate this one premise, that the Nauvoo Expositor is in fact good evidence of Joseph Smith's polygamy, of Joseph Smith's having exercised polygamy. And it's on the Unfiltered Rise podcast. I feel like I did well. Somebody else will have to tell me.
Yeah, I watched all of that debate, and it was certainly interesting. You know, debating that one single topic kind of hamstrings you, because most of the other good evidence really came out later from affidavits and, you know, Todd Compton in Sacred Loneliness. You know, a lot of information came out afterwards. And if you're only going to be confined to the Nauvoo Expositor, that makes it a little bit harder. But I thought it was a very interesting debate. As far as, you know, debating Jacob Hansen, Jacob Isbell, you got to be careful, because these guys actually took it out to the ring after they were done. They weren't satisfied with just merely having a war of words. They took it into the ring, Exmo. Joe, are you going to be doing that with Jacob Isbell too?
I'd say there was some insinuation towards the end of my debate with Jacob Isbell, and I just shut it down right away to say, I just want to make it clear here that I am a man of peace. I don't know any jujitsu. I don't know any kudo, any kenpo. I don't know any mixed martial arts, friends. I prefer to debate with my words. I'm a grown adult here.
Yeah, no. So Jacob Hansen did get a couple of licks in here, but I guess Jacob Isbell got the last laugh, I believe, right?
Yeah, Heidi Love, actually, whose podcast we were on, she actually went to that. I entertained the idea for a minute and then said no. I think it was conference weekend, I think is what it was. And I'm like, am I going to get on the I-15 on conference weekend? You better believe, fuck, no, that's not going to happen. Sorry. But no, that's not going to happen.
Yeah, Jacob Isbell is certainly one of the most prolific polygamy deniers out there. There's no doubt about that. But when it comes to polygamy denial, I really don't think anybody here takes a backseat to, you know, Michelle Stone over there at 132 Problems. I'm sure you're familiar with her. And I used to watch a lot of her content, honestly. I've watched quite a few of her episodes, probably a couple dozen. And I unsubscribed to her after she had this discussion here with John Hamer. And really, for anybody out there, if you really want to understand this entire debate, I would refer you to this particular episode here, which is episode 86. The history is never settled. And for John Hamer, the history is absolutely settled. And he absolutely hands Michelle Stone her lunch. And not only has Michelle Stone's lunch been handed to her by John Hamer, but it's been handed to her by Brian Hales and, quite frankly, many other people too. That's why I no longer listen to these guys, is I don't find a lot of value in it. What are your thoughts?
If Brian Hales has better history than you're in bad shape. You better go back to the drawing board there. But, you know, look, apologetics is an interesting thing, because you really can't say it's history. You know, it at the end of the day is making a case for that you aren't thinking critically about the subject, and you want others to not think critically about the subject. You just want them to believe, because you believe that there's a virtue in believing and vice in disbelieving what was a claim made by the church or by the scriptures or by, you know, whatever you apologize on behalf of. The apologetics game is really an exercise in intellectual dishonesty, my opinion.
Yeah, absolutely. No doubt about that. Now let's talk real quick about your book here. Because that is my moniker. Look at my moniker here, Joe. It says Korihor was right. And this is coming from your book here called The Korihor Argument, A Missionary's
Mhm.
Journey Out of Mormonism. For the first edition of The Korihor Argument, author Joe Rollins will be donating a portion of his sales to help the children of Peru. So what is the
Mhm.
Korihor Argument? What's that all about?
So you can't get it on Amazon. I mean, obviously you can find some lingering paperback copies out there, but I've stopped all the other sales of like the Kindle version and so forth. Right now, I'm publishing it chapter by chapter on Hellfire.agency. I mean, you are Johnny on the spot with that. Yep. So people who subscribe to Hellfire.agency and get my for $6.66 a month, maybe your eternal soul, can get access to my audiobook as I release it, as well as to all my other materials, including the long form, my long form content and so forth. But the Korihor Argument is basically a memoir about how I lost my faith in God as a missionary in Peru, and combines with it the philosophy that went along with the existential crisis that I experienced as a part of my losing faith in God and in the church. So, and I try to make it funny. That's the one thing I was asked by Samantha at Zelf on the Shelf once when they did a review of Korihor. She said, "What is it that you wish people knew about the Korihor Argument?" And I said that it's funny. You would never guess by the cover, but there's a lot of funny stuff in there, actually.
Very interesting. And by the way, what is the Hellfire Agency? You've got several different podcasts here that cover Tim Ballard, Hillsdale Family Values, Blood Atonement, all kinds of stuff here. This site is really off the hook. What is going on over here?
Okay, so I've been trying to get caught up, but the thing is that Ted Bundy and Tim Ballard take up like all my time, and I do have a family and I do have a job to do and so forth. So, but basically, the two series that are actively going right now are Blood Atonement, which is a series about murder among the Mormons. Mostly, I've covered Ted Bundy, but I've got some materials lined up for the story of the framing and murder of labor activist Joe Hill in 1915. And also I've got some materials being prepared about the Danites and the Mountain Meadows Massacre, etc. And yeah, and even one story that I've been trying to get edited and published all summer. I'll probably get it done soon, which is an interesting story about Charlie Chaplin's butler, who was murdered here in Utah by a Mormon boy that he apparently proposed marriage to. It's a wild story, but I talked to a historian, an LGBTQIA historian here in Utah. Bet you didn't know we had those. But yeah, and it was a very interesting story how these two employees of Charlie Chaplin's basically stole a bunch of money and ran off to Utah to be lovers, apparently, or at least one of them thought so. And when the other one figured out that that's what he wanted, I pulled over on the side of the road and he murdered him. So, I mean, it's fascinating how much true crime follows Mormonism. I mean, I would say there's a disproportionate amount here. At least, maybe it just feels that way. But in brief, the Hellfire Agency podcast covers scandals on America's religious right. I don't want to be pigeonholed into just Mormon true crime. It just happens to be mostly that because I stupidly decided to take on the Tim Ballard thing. So yeah.
Well, Mormon true crime is absolutely a tremendous genre. It's got a lot of traction out there. I mean, we have Murder Among the Mormons, we have Keep Sweet, Pray and Obey. It's just a fantastic genre that is always going to get a lot of clicks and a lot of likes. And especially if you can go outside of that to a larger Christian right, then you have the potential of having a lot of people view your podcast. So I've watched a couple of episodes of what you're doing, and I find it to be very interesting. And that does kind of bring us to the reason that we actually got connected together, is because you have asked Jacob Hansen, the thoughtful saint over there, for a debate, but he hasn't responded yet. But he has challenged me to a debate here. And this video here, I want to give you the overview of this, and we're going to talk about that for the remainder of this episode here. And I accepted a debate with Jacob Hansen. Let me give you the background, Joe, of this debate and the exact topics that are associated with it. I'm just going to play the first couple of minutes of this. It's just going to give you the idea about what Jacob Hansen wants to have a debate with me about. And then let's get your thoughts. Jacob Hansen is the creator and host of the Thoughtful Faith YouTube channel and podcast. His content focuses on exploring faith, particularly within the context of the Latter-day Saint LDS tradition. Hansen is known for engaging in formal debates on religious topics, which he believes help clarify beliefs through contrast and discussion with those who hold differing views. Brother Hansen also regularly espouses anti-gay, anti-trans, and homophobic rhetoric in the name of his favorite God. I hosted Jacob on the Mormon News Roundup in July of 2023 in episode 68. Oh, and just so you know, I'm Dives, the host of the Mormon News Roundup, the handsome guy on the left. Like and subscribe, and don't forget to think celestial while you're at it. Now, while Jacob and I were discussing the Mormon Church's unprecedented global temple building spree, Jacob made an incredible claim during that program. Let me play it for you.
Every dollar that the church uses is for humanitarian aid. The building of temples is a form of humanitarian aid if you really believe that temples and temple covenants do good for humanity. In fact, I would argue that the greatest poverty program in the world is the LDS temple program, because when people make and keep covenants in temples, when our missionaries go and teach people to live the laws of the gospel, we actually fight poverty, but we fight it at its roots. So any funds given to the church to further the work of Zion is a charitable humanitarian contribution.
Come on.
Okay,
bro.
okay, all right. Let's take your thoughts here so far about what Jacob said here, Joe.
My God, just I mean, at least I'll give this to Jacob Hansen. He's consistent. I don't know if you've seen, but he has done debates and conversations with like his brother who is an atheist. I guess he has multiple brothers who are atheists, which is an interesting thing now. And that where he talks about the fact that he has this theory, this epistemology, or this philosophy of what is true and what is real, that all basically is undergirded by the axiomatic values, which is actually fairly consistent with the church's values. I can go on at that. I talk about that in the Korihor argument, dating back to when I first published it like a decade ago, basically, when I was excommunicated. Got the letter right there. Bam. And it's interesting to me, because it's like, well, he has this value that says basically, first, you must determine what the morals are of all the people arguing. Then from there, you can, or the moral argument, the moral case for whatever you're trying to figure out. And then from there, you will find out all the temporal and spiritual truths about that. So he appears to think that, the more he believes that this is true, that, every dollar given to the church is the most beneficial, philanthropic effort in humanity, that the harder you believe it, the truer it gets. And so if you find anything that looks even tangentially like it supports your argument, regardless of how non sequitur the logic is, well, then believing it harder will make it truer. And that's just not the way I think most people would think that truth works, but certainly a very Mormon way.
Yeah, so you're saying that he relies on a number of presuppositions and axioms to determine his entire worldview, and that's based off his entire idea here, which is there are certain witnesses or ways in which we can determine the truth, and basically the foundation for this 5-witness model is basically based off of feeling the Spirit. The Spirit is the teacher of all truth, and therefore, just like the scriptures say, it will guide you into all truth. And when Jacob debated, or at least had conversations with Bill Reel, for instance, everything kind of devolved in that, because that's the problem with presuppositionalists, is if you can't justify, according to them, if you as an atheist can't justify your beliefs, then you have no standing upon which to reach a final conclusion. And he kept hammering away at the morality of Bill Reel and saying, how can you determine objective truth and be a moral person? And Bill Reel, according to Jacob, didn't give satisfactory answers, and they ended up abandoning the debate.
Yeah, I mean, which is quite a curious thing. Again, I was a Mormon for 21 years, really stopped practicing Mormonism when I decided at the end of my mission that I no longer believed in God, which was a shock to me, I will tell you, because I had not expected that to be the outcome. But that was 21, which is in 2001. I just turned 44 a couple of weeks ago. So I have been an atheist longer than I was a Mormon. And to this day, I cannot tell what to this day, I cannot tell what an atheist believes. So far, what I know is what atheists don't believe and why it bothers people who are believers, because people who are believers are disturbed by other people not believing what they believe. And then you can go ahead and fill in whatever you want if you attack somebody else by their beliefs. But then even by your own admission, by your own label you put on them, they don't have any beliefs to attack. I mean, what is the atheist position on outer space? That there isn't God in it, I guess. I don't know. I mean,
that's it.
That's like there's nothing there is, as Sam Harris said, no content to it. In fact, that speech, which Sam Harris pissed off quite a few atheists, because we do have some people who feel like we're at least are in a club. I mean, even if it's circumstantially a club, we're in a club. He said it's like every time that we as atheists take on the believer's label for us as atheists, it's like we walked up to a chalk outline at a crime scene and laid down in it. You know, it's like, why do we let them label us like this? So, because at the end of the day, atheism isn't about what we believe. It's about how we don't belong to these other clubs of people who do believe.
Yeah, Sam Harris said that he doesn't really like the label of atheist because there's no horoscopist, there's no fairyist, there's no leprechaunist, and he doesn't think that that label really conveys much meaning. And obviously, he has got a great point there, even though for convenience sake, it is definitely a label that can be used. Now, let's continue on here because let's get into the actual substance here, because he tweets out here, we're giving you the preparation for this debate, and you're going to help me out on this, which I appreciate, since I don't have any debating background, quite frankly, whatsoever. And we're going to see the exact verbiage that he wants to debate on.
Seriously.
This was the single most disliked short I have ever produced. In response to Cult's reposting of that clip, Jacob challenged me to a debate. I haven't done a debate since my 9th grade speech class at Hillcrest Junior High School in Murray, Utah, which I lost, by the way.
You lose.
I have never made a response to Jacob because, quite frankly, I'm not a debater.
Coward! Coward! Coward!
Jacob, on the other hand, he's a really good debater. He's done debates with all kinds of different folks in all kinds of different venues, talking about Mormonism, Christianity, the resurrection, and a number of different topics.
Debatable.
I would say that Jacob is one of the best active LDS debaters around. He's intimidating, and he's very forceful and knowledgeable. So Jacob is claiming that building LDS temples is the single best way to alleviate poverty on this planet. Okay, so let's read this. Let's just be very careful here. Okay, this is the debate. Is the temple and its covenants the greatest anti-poverty program ever? It would literally be a formal debate with equal time, etc. If you can't defend your opinions, you should keep them to yourself while the grown-ups are talking. Come on my show and we'll debate it. Then you can see all the evidence. Okay, here's the outline of what he wants to debate. What are your initial thoughts here, Exmo Joe?
Yeah, so it's quite a bold claim. I think that it will be interesting to see what he uses to back it up. Unfortunately, I feel like I already have a preview because I watched the Trent Horn debate where he debated a Catholic on Pints with Aquinas, isn't it? And he, you know, and I felt like, you know, some people were pretty impressed with how he held his own against Trent Horn. At least Stephen Pinecker thought so. I actually did not. First of all, you know, he's not a particularly good debater, Jacob Hansen. I got to be blunt with you. Now, I was going to feel a little full of myself having been the captain of the Lincoln Douglas debate team when I was in high school. But you know, where I mostly lost, I broke one time by default. But here's the point: is that he's a gish galloper, and gish galloping can sound and feel very impressive, but in debates, any debater will tell you it's all about the flow chart. If you can't follow through all of the rounds of the debate, the storyline and the points as they are nailed down and as they are eliminated by the opponents, if you can't follow it, you can't track points to the end. And that's the reason why I started into the Korihor argument when I said, like, look, the oldest of my doubts, it started in the Book of Mormon about the church, is that you read the debate between Alma and Korihor, really between Ammon, Gedona, and Alma and Korihor, and he wins. He very clearly wins because he stays consistent through all of his points, and for the most part, they don't answer anything to him. In fact, in Ammon's case, it says he answered him nothing. So that's the thing. Yes, the thing about gish gallopers is this: if you stopped to address every little thing, circumstantial piece of evidence they try to, pigeonhole you down, instead of just challenging and saying, okay, what is the logic, first of all, that is relevant to the case, right? You can tell me about the church's philanthropy, But if that particular branch of philanthropy has nothing to do with the temple, then why are we bringing it up? That's not relevant. That's as quick and easy as it is to say, let's not talk about that because it's not even relevant to the point. We're out. And so it's that's the point, is that he'll try to pigeonhole you into wasting your time talking about one point or that point, and that way he can get more of his points to feel like they survived to the end. So at the end of the day, a debate, even for in layman's terms, is really a story, a rhetorical story of something that is sequitur, that has a logical consistency from beginning to end, that people in the future will be able to look back on and say, the one guy had a rhetorical story that made sense beginning to end, defended it well, and the other guy didn't have anything to say against it. Just, verbally vomiting and regurgitating, this circumstantial and that circumstantial and that circumstantial and that circumstantial thing because you think it supports your claim. That's pretty poor debating, because the logic isn't there.
Well, let's not forget, first of all, that the church's humanitarian efforts are mostly unsubstantiated. They're basically claims, and because the church is not externally audited, we cannot confirm the $1.4 billion, the vast majority of it, that the church claims in 2023. Now, and we can call up some of the agencies that the church gives money to and confirm that, yes, indeed, that the church gave money to them. But the problem, of course, is that sometimes that money is returned to the church under the table, and the church doesn't report that. So even if we can call them up now, that doesn't mean that the church will not get that money back in some form in the future. So all church humanitarian reports are unverified claims without any substance. Now, we covered the Trent Horn and Jacob Hansen debate very thoroughly here with Colby Reddish, and we did a 2+ hour debate breakdown on that. I think you got a chance to watch that, Exmo Joe. What did you think of our breakdown here of the Hansen Horn debate?
It was amusing and well thought out. I mean, at least I was like, it's nice to be able to listen to intelligent people who are actually, like I said, flow charting it. You're actually going through the points that are being made and saying, each line by line, is that addressing the point? Because it just feels like you're talking at that point. And that was what I liked about that coverage of the debate. And I made a few comments on that when it went live or when it premiered or whatever it was. And I really enjoyed it. I thought that was good coverage.
Very well. Let's just cover the last minute or two of this Dives accepts a debate challenge from Jacob Hansen. This is going to flesh everything out for you. Now, I have never seen LDS temples mentioned in connection to fighting poverty whatsoever, except in the context where people say that the less temples are built, the more money the LDS church would actually have to be able to help other people on this planet. I think you got the gist of it here with the breakdown here, as far as that's concerned here. Sorry, I just want to check out this thumbnail before we jump into the share document. How do you like this thumbnail, by the way?
I love it. I make all this effort to take photographs of me doing different poses and things so that people who have me on their program can have different things to work with and make it entertaining, because the thumbnail is a big deal in the YouTube world. If your thumbnail isn't interesting, then people don't click. And then everybody winds up taking depressed selfies I posted to Facebook. But I have to say, I don't hate it. I like looking at that right now, and I'm like, oh, really? That's cool. That actually is cool. That's kind of funny.
That's good. Okay, now we have this. I appreciate that. Now we built a shared document here where
you're showing the document. You're showing our behind the curtain. What?
Yeah, why not? You want to keep it secret? You want to keep it sacred?
I'm joking.
Okay,
yeah,
that's fine.
Keep it safe.
I don't care. See, I don't care
teasing.
if Jacob has all of our ideas, because I think our ideas are good, and I don't think that there's good arguments against them. So I have no problem airing them in public. So you wrote this first paragraph here. So let's check this out. You said that the key to Jacob's epistemology is that axiomatic values undergird all truth, both spiritual and temporal. For any person to disbelieve any claimed virtues of the church is either ignorant or malicious, and that is to presume that any true or virtuous claims made about the church is a virtue. All other points must fit into that framework. Can you elucidate, what did you mean by that?
Okay, so I am trying to like reword this as I go into more human language so that the humans will think I'm among them and one of them. But this is the point. You'll see this in the debate with Trent Horn. You'll see it in the debate he did with his brother. You see it in the debate. The debate with Jacob Isbell. He says frequently, Jacob Hansen has a tendency to say, "Look, to be critical of this virtuous statement of the church, it indicates that you are either ignorant of the church or that you just hate the church." And so and once again, that's going back to his epistemology that says the base layer of all truth is the axiomatic or the morals. Everybody who believes for a moral reason. Everybody who disbelieves believes for an immoral reason, right? And so if we let him pigeonhole people into that epistemology, first of all, we're not attacking the main reason why his logic is unsound, number one, and number two, we're letting him get away with something that just doesn't make any sense. So I have to say, the first and foremost thing is, instead of taking every point that he makes seriously, take the point seriously where they actually have value. Nobody is disagreeing that the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints does philanthropy work and that it benefits the lives of people around the world. That's not the point. That's not the claim that he made. The claim that he's making is that temples are the best ladder out of poverty that exists at all in the world. That means you Catholics have something that you do for people around the world, your own philanthropy. Screw you. It's not as good because you don't have temples. The American Red Cross, screw you. You don't have temples. UNICEF, you don't have temples. So you don't. So you're not doing it. You're not the one. So at this date, you don't have to prove that the Mormon Church doesn't do anything good. You don't have to prove that the Mormon Church isn't true. You don't have to prove that you dislike the Mormon Church or love the Mormon Church or that anybody else does. These are not important things. The question here is there even one organization in the world? Is there even one effort by one organization or individual in the world that could be said to be better for giving people a ladder out of poverty than the Mormon Church building temples? If the answer is yes, then he's lost. And that's the corner that Jacob has painted himself into.
I agree 100%. Now, I put down about some arguments that are on the pro side, and I want to get your thoughts on those, on some of the rational arguments that I think a person could try to make to justify Jacob's position. So, number one, arguments in support of the claim that building Mormon temples and LDS prosperity gospel lifts people out of poverty. Number one, you could argue that it's job creation through temple construction, because building temples requires labor, providing local jobs in construction, engineering, maintenance, stimulating local economies, and offering employment to those in need. Joe, I don't think it can be argued that building a Mormon temple does create jobs and has an economic impact, at least in the construction industry and where you're building it.
It's an interesting question because it gets into the minutia of, well, are we talking about in the United States or outside the United States? Are we talking, because there's various, places and various ways the church in various places builds temples. But even if you were to take it at, that you come up with some kind of, statistic that says X amount of dollars goes into the community at the time when the temple is built, that's short-term benefit into a community. Number one, and number two, there's no way that amount of that amount of money is going to amount to anywhere close to the whole amount of money alone, let alone the overall economic impact of all the other individual efforts by every single organization in the world. So, I just don't see that can support his claim, even if he were to find impressive data on the subject, which I agree. I don't think he'll find any.
Yeah, what you need to do is compare the return on investment. So an average temple costs about $30 to $40 million. We need to compare that with improving access to education or improving healthcare or giving microloans or improving sanitation or providing vaccinations. How does that $40 million in a temple affect a community versus all of those other metrics that we know alleviate poverty. So you've got to demonstrate that the temple is the number one out of all of those. And that really, in my opinion, needs to be proved mathematically with a sophisticated business type return on investment. And I think he's going to struggle to find studies that can confirm that.
And yes, you're exactly right. And then in addition to that is the exclusivity, right? The basic logic here is that you have to prove that the church doesn't do that in places where it doesn't build temples, that there's not the same thing that happens when, so in the case of construction of temples, of course, that only happens where they build temples. But then at the same time, how much economic impact can that be said to have when he then tries to attach into it? Then you add on top of that fast offerings. Whoa, that fast offerings have nothing to do with the temple. Well, what about tithes? What about, so forth? I think the best argument that Jacob can make at that point will be to make some kind of tenuous connection to say where the church builds temples, it then follows up and builds other economic stimulating activity, such as the church's for-profit businesses, the bookstores, the thrift stores, and the church's educational programs, CES and things like that. But again, he's going to have to prove that the church doesn't do that where it doesn't put temples, and that the church doesn't do that in that community if it doesn't have a temple. And so it's like, again, I'm just trying to give him the benefit of a doubt and say maybe he's got a way to wheedle it in there. But so far as I can tell, I don't think that there's such data to prove that.
Yeah. Now, according to the church's humanitarian report in 2023, the church gave away about $1.4 billion. But the issue, as you just pointed out, is that 800 million of that, by the way, is unverified fast offering, which has nothing to do with covenants whatsoever. That has nothing to do with the temple. You don't have to pay fast offerings whatsoever to get a temple recommend. You just have to pay a full tithing. So we can set aside all of that, which is a pass through anyway. Now, the second point here that I put in was spiritual motivation for hard work. The LDS prosperity gospel promotes diligence and financial success as part of God's blessings. This encourages members to work hard, pursue education, and be entrepreneurial, which can can elevate them out of poverty. And there's no doubt that a number of studies have shown that the Mormon church in particular has an inverse relationship with the amount of education that a person has vis-a-vis other religions, typically in other faiths. The more education that you have, the less likely you are to be an adherent. But in the Mormon church, that's actually flipped. The higher the education you have, the more sincere you believe very strongly. So can we not say that there is a hard work that is inculcated in the membership and an encouragement for education, and that would have socioeconomic benefits for members of the church?
I think that there is an argument to make there, as long as that could be made on any kind of debate about whether or not the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints actually does inculcate values of hard work in its members. But just to connect it directly to the temple, what I see in the challenge that Jacob made there in his statement on Twitter and his statement in the discussion with you is to connect it to covenants, of which in the temple, there are 4 primary laws that every person in the endowment process that this is apart from all the other ordinances. There are 4 primary laws that everybody covenants to obey, including the church's own internal Bolshevism, by the way. But one of those is the law of sacrifice. You could make the case that the law of sacrifice pertains to this hard work principle. Again, that is a tenuous example. But again, you'd have to prove that the church only teaches that and only reinforces that, or at least you'd have to make the case that it most strongly enforces or promotes that belief system, that work ethic inside the temple, that it's like a secret until you get to the temple, which I think you would find very difficult to do. If anything, the church does more promoting hard work and the values of work outside of the temple.
Now, technically, there's actually 5 temple covenants, and the church is a little bit more open about what they are these days than they were probably back when you went through. But probably the most germane here to our discussion is the law of consecration, which means dedicating our time, talents, and everything which with the Lord has blessed us to building up the Jesus Christ church on earth and to the establishment of Zion. And that, of course, does, I don't see that as something that could have a benefit to you. If your promise is to give everything away to a mega corporation, how can it then be argued that that's going to be some kind of a benefit to you? It'd be different if you were making a promise to the church that if you attended your Sunday meetings or did this or that or the other, that the church would reward you financially. Then I think an argument can be made. But I just don't see an argument with the law of consecration here.
Yeah. Interestingly enough, I actually think the law of consecration is the best case he could make here. The law of consecration, at the end of the day, as I said, this is Mormon Marxism. I mean, it just happens to have been written down and created about the same time as Karl Marx was coming up with his ideas in Europe and before the publication of the Communist Manifesto. But basically, Joseph Smith, as he believed in it, the law of consecration is redistribution of wealth at the end of the day. Now, if the temple and the commitment that we all made when we went to the temple, I did at least, if we were really actually living the law of consecration in terms of like the United Order and these various United Order plans that failed fantastically in the Mormon experiment, if we were living that and the temple was the center of that law and it was in full effect today, I'd say you'd have a case to make that temples actually may be the greatest equalizer, because what happens is that all the wealthy people who join the church are expected to give their property, their money, their time, their talents, all to the church, and which had a philosophy, sounds very familiar to any person who's ever studied communism, that it took from each man according to his ability and returning to each according to his need. You could argue that is, well, first of all, I don't see how anybody gets away anymore with pretending that that's not communism. They say, well, in communism, it's forced, where in the church's version, it's all voluntary. Well, go back and read the manifesto again. I mean, that is Marxism at its purest form. Or read Utopia by Sir Thomas More, which is even further back in history. And so basically, I think that he would have a case to make, honestly enough, with the law of consecration, were it not for the fact that really what the law of consecration is now is a commitment by members of the church to give uncompensated labor to the church. And uncompensated labor is not redistribution of wealth. Uncompensated labor is slavery. And so, at best.
And it's not just uncompensated labor. It's everything with which the Lord has blessed you, with which he has blessed you, or with which he may bless you to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. It's also donations. It's everything that you have, even to your very life, if necessary. So that is in contrast to, early Mormons in that section 42 of the Doctrine and Covenants. This was called the law of the church, which is what they tried to implement there for a short period of time in late 1830, early 1831, where they were supposed to have no poor among them. They all pooled their resources together, and they supposedly, lived in a communal situation where there was no poor among them. I agree that there could be an argument made to say, well, that does raise people who are in poverty out of poverty, but the church no longer implements that for one reason, is because it failed spectacularly. So I don't see that as an argument that Jacob's probably going to go to. Now,
in addition to that, and
yeah.
I'm sorry, I hate to interrupt you, but I'll
Go
make
ahead.
it quickly. I would get down on my knees and praise. I would go to a sacrament meeting. I'd go to half of a sacrament meeting. If you could please, for the love of God, get Jacob Hansen, Mr. Super Anarcho-Capitalist, to come out to the forefront, Mr. Uber Libertarian, and say that he believes, in fact, that the true law of the gospel and the reason why we need temples is because when Jesus returns for his millennial reign, we will all live as communists. Please do it. But I guarantee you that's not likely to happen.
That is an excellent point. I don't think he's going to be arguing for that, because he even believes that basic taxation from the government he thinks is immoral, and that we shouldn't render to Caesar that which is Caesar's. We should try to keep as much as possible for ourselves, which is why he's on board with the church fraudulently and shamefully hoarding hundreds of billions of dollars. And he's even tweeted out the hashtag make it a trillion. So yeah, I don't think he's going to be going for that line of argument. You're probably right. Now, number 3 here is increased economic activity. Temple construction and maintenance requires materials and services, which can boost local businesses from hospitality to retail, benefiting the overall community and lifting others up economically. And according to the Widow's White report, Joe, temple maintenance costs about $250 million per year. Can that not be argued that that does help local communities?
I think so. Actually, I think that you could, if he finds some kind of data, whether it be that or some other kind of data to show even that some kind of infrastructure or logistics established by the church in the maintenance of the temples and or the maintenance of grounds or facilities, near temples like family research centers or, what have you, garment distribution facilities or what have you. Even at that, you would still be stuck to this exclusivity that says, and that is better than anything that's being done by any organization, individual, or entity in the world at any point in time. And I just don't see that. I mean, even if it were a numbers game, which I agree with you, it's got to be more than the sum of its parts. You got to be able to show it's not just about how much money went into it. It's about how much economic activity it creates, how well it that economic impact permeates into the society, whether or not that is getting stuck inside Mormon channels, or in other words, yes, we're giving philanthropy, but only Mormons in the community are primarily benefiting from it. Those are all factors that you're going to have to address if you're going to make the claim that this economic impact is reaching further than any other economic impact in the world.
Yeah, and obviously one of the issues with that is the fact that the best available data says that there's probably around 900,000 temple recommend holding adults in the church. And that's obviously a very small number of people that any temple really is going to benefit. And considering that the church is not gaining as far as population of the church on the global population, the church is slightly below. We're not going to see any, if you pump money into an organization that has a diminishing level of potential returns, then I don't see that that is going to be a value add for most of these communities, which is why in places like Fairview and Bakersfield and Cody, Wyoming, these communities, not one of them has ever said, oh, we want this temple because of the economic benefits that are going to come to our community. Then none of them ever make that argument. In fact, the church doesn't make it either. These are arguments that even the church itself doesn't make. So how about number 4 here? Educational emphasis. The church places a strong emphasis on education, which is often linked to rising prosperity. Temples symbolize the importance of lifelong learning, and members are encouraged to invest in their personal development. Can that be linked together as far as educational attainment? We kind of touched on that earlier.
Yeah, I think that again, yes, that if we were having a debate about whether or not the church invests in education and whether or not education within the church has a positive economic benefit on the members of the church and on their communities, I would say I'd have to take a second look at whether or not I argue against that, because I think that honestly can be argued to be real. But again, you're stuck in this exclusivity problem, which is, but does the church only do that where there are temples? Does the temple what role does the temple play in that? And there, I think that's where I have said, just reviewing church, because I did a quick review of Jacob's other debates. Then I started going through materials that he has used in the past and materials I think he's likely to use. And there are conference reports and church produced materials that use this house of learning, a concept, an idea that says, look, inside the temple, you have the celestial room. And then the celestial room only exists inside Mormon temples, according to Mormonism. And that there are spiritual and temporal truths that you will learn in the celestial room, or that you will learn at least in this, temple liturgy, that you won't learn anywhere else. And but again, none of that. I don't think that anybody's going to the celestial room and coming out knowing how to code Python. I don't think anybody's going into the celestial room and coming out learning how to be a paralegal. It's, those aren't things that you're going to learn. And so, I mean, unless the Mormon church only invests educational resources into temples, I don't see how it's relevant to the case.
Right. Just real quick, the church allocates in the last year in 2022, $1.02 billion in tithing was allocated to subsidize the cost of the BYUs. We have BYU Hawaii, BYU Provo, BYU Idaho, and then we also have the Pathways program. We used to have Ensign College, and BYU Provo takes up $785 billion. These are B's with a billion, excuse me, with a million, 785 million. And that's a total amount. So when you're giving a donation to the church, that is helping educate a number of students. The church has up to 100,000 students mixed among the campuses of BYU. I don't think that you can argue against the fact that that is doing good for those students. And all of the studies show that when you get an education, however much education that you get, you are more likely to have better socioeconomic status and have better life outcomes. I think that's demonstrable.
Yeah, I think that in addition to that, you take the fact that, I don't know if you've been watching Secret Lives of Mormon Housewives on Hulu. It's quite frankly, I thought it was going to be more entertaining than it is. It turns out to be a little more aggravating than I thought. But you'll see in the opening shots of the sequence, the opening sequence of the show, that they're all walking away from the not from the Bountiful, but the Provo Temple. I'm pretty sure it's the Provo Temple. They used to call them the Tie-Tack temples, with a staple in the middle and then the outside part. Yeah, there you go. Okay, there you go. I'm pretty sure that may be Bountiful, but it doesn't have the Bountiful Temple.
That's Provo.
That's Provo, right? So right now the church is rebuilding that temple because it's falling into its basement, like the Salt Lake Temple is, and they've had to do the same thing there. Now, okay, so if BYU needs a temple in order for it to be a house of learning, okay, BYU Provo, for example, you have to consider that they've shut that thing down so that they could rebuild it, and they're investing tithe payers' money into rebuilding this temple. Meanwhile, there are within 10 minutes, you and I know, well, no, you're on these. Well, I'll tell you, I'm sure you've been to Utah or lived in Utah at some point, right?
Oh, yeah.
That within 10 minutes of BYU, you have at least half a dozen temples, including the new one that was basically, the rumor has it that it was basically rebuilt, an old temple, an old tabernacle over by New Skin's offices that burnt down was rebuilt into a temple basically on the dime of the president.
The Provo City Temple.
Right. And exactly. And so now you can go to the temple there. They can, within 15 minutes, they can go to the temple, Mount Timpanogos, which is like walking distance from my house, right? And so it's like, okay, so why, if the temples are this house of learning, and that's in some way connected to BYU, why then are they rebuilding the temple in Provo? I mean, at the end of the day, you just can't keep passing off the church's reinvestment into commercial real estate and or multi-zoned real estate regions of its overall infrastructure of real estate investments, and say, well, this is about developing the education of the people. I mean, you can build BYU campuses anywhere. In fact, you take BYU online and probably do more good with it than you could ever do in Provo. So I mean, I don't really see that there's an argument there.
Okay, let's go on to number 5, support networks. Temple attendance often strengthens community bonds among members, creating supportive networks that can offer financial advice, job opportunities, and resources to those struggling in poverty. And this is really a significant, I think this is a very good point. For instance, the atheistic community, it doesn't have a community. If you're sick, if you're, off of a job, typically, let's be honest with you, the atheist community is not as likely to bring you a casserole like the Reliefs say they are. If you're a Mormon and you're struggling, a lot of times they will send people to your house. That doesn't always happen in the atheistic community. It seems like this is one of the positive benefits of religion that can be argued to help socioeconomic status. If you have solidarity, you come to your community on Sunday, or if you move from a place to a place and you have a new community and you fall on hard times, oftentimes, but not always, oftentimes church members will come to your need. Does that not help your economic status?
Yes, and I'll tell you, this is the reason why I say, and I've seen and heard you make comments like this that I have been making in the 2 days since we started into this preparation effort that, boy, I'm sure glad we're not debating against us, because honestly, that is probably one of the better cases that one could make, is especially that ward and stake employment coordinator callings are
Yeah.
extremely beneficial to members of the church. The argument against it, first of all, again, is that you don't need temples to make it happen, number one. You could probably try to make that pass with, well, the church only builds temples where there are a certain number of stakes and wards, but I'm not sure that that's true anymore. In fact, I think you could probably find some good cases that's not true. And so so there's the fact that that's not directly tied with temples, and you'd have a hard time proving that it was. And then secondarily, and we've talked about this very briefly, those efforts to employ people in the ward, generally, they're not supposed to be exclusively for Mormons and people investigating Mormonism, but I think you will find, if you look into it, they overwhelmingly are. So the knockdown argument there is, first of all, that doesn't have anything to do with temples. And secondly, that if you were to really look at it, you have to consider that this nepotism inside the church, which is well established. Now, that one I can tell you, there are court cases that has been proved, like, for example, University of Phoenix and so forth, that's been shown that when prominent leaders or prominent business people in the Mormon church get into positions where they can make hiring decisions, they tend to give bonuses, they tend to give promotions, and they tend to give jobs to other members of the church. To say that that is lifting people out of poverty is not entirely honest. That's lifting Mormons out of poverty, maybe. But even then, how many of those were people who grew up in privilege anyway? And so, I think that he'd have a pretty long case to be made there, in spite of the fact that it can't be argued. I really don't think it can. I don't think it can be argued against that the church's employment benefits and its efforts to keep its members employed is of economic benefit to members and maybe investigators into the church. Maybe occasionally you have people who are coming to the Mormon church and saying, hey, I heard you guys will help anybody get a job. And maybe those people actually find themselves, with a job, somewhere. But by and large, I think you'll find that there's a lot of evidence to prove that it's more about nepotism than it is about investing in the community.
Okay, next up here is the church welfare system, the well-known church system here. Funded by tithes and offerings, is designed to help members in financial distress. Temples are seen as a symbol of God's blessings, motivating members to tithe, which supports these welfare initiatives. And we've even had, this is one of the church's calling cards here. When President Trump came a few years ago to visit Salt Lake City, he went to go see Welfare Square, which allegedly gives out hundreds of millions of dollars. And here he is rubbing shoulders with the late Orrin Hatch, President Nelson, President Eyring. Can it not be argued that Welfare Square is a significant boon to the socioeconomic status of people in this, on this planet? Therefore, a donation to the church will result in less suffering.
I mean, I was with you up until that last part. Look, I mean, if you wanted to make a case that the New Deal and the FDR's New Deal era benefited largely from learning about how the Mormon church actually built its welfare system, and that I don't think there can be any denial of that. That's actually true. But all that would tell you about that is that perhaps the U.S. government is actually better at lifting people out of poverty because of what it learned from Mormonism and applying it at a larger scale, which again tells you that the church isn't the best actor in the game, number one. Number two, that that welfare system was developed long before the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints had developed its first temple in Utah, and when its only temple in operation really was in Nauvoo, and by that point was basically burned out and used as a barn, etc. And so and so to say that this is directly correlated to the development of temples is going to be quite a big ask. It's a logical leap no matter how you slice it.
Yeah, having watched quite a bit of Jacob's content, I know that he subscribes to the so-called prosperity gospel. And the basics of the prosperity gospel is that if you're faithful, if you, don't drink coffee, if you go to the temple and you do what you're supposed to do, then God will bless you, not just spiritually, but there will be demonstrable blessings in your life, and that will be financially. And gets to point number 7, which is linked to faithfulness. LDS prosperity gospel teaches that obedience to God's commandments, including tithing and temple attendance, results in material and spiritual blessings, motivating members to adopt practices that may improve their financial situations. Do you think that this argument is sound?
I think it's better than the law of sacrifice stuff. So the first law is the law of obedience. There are 5. You're right. I stand corrected. The law of obedience is that you are supposed to be obedient to the leadership of the church, and in and also respective in there is wives being obedient to their husbands as they're obedient to God. But part of the obedience, I think that he could make the case that, for example, you can associate statistics about people who don't drink, enjoy better health, work longer hours, and earn more money. I'm sure there's plenty of statistics out there. So Mormons who make temple covenants to be obedient to the church and to its standards and to the word of wisdom, therefore are making more money. First of all, okay, so you're making at least there's a logical case to be made there, but you're going to have to show the real world data that when you put that against some kind of control, that's been shown to be true. I'm not gonna jump for that unless you get some really impressive data. The other thing is you have to show that it's making the commitment to abide by the word of wisdom in the temple that makes it binding, or at least maybe even that the worthiness for a temple recommend is what drives that kind of economic pumping activity, being obedient to those principles. I think that you're going to have to have a better logical argument than I think that Mormons are going to should be making better money or should be having more economic opportunity and putting more money into circulation into the economy, raising all ships, if they are abiding by this law or that law, because they covenant in the church to be obedient. But effectively, when you get baptized outside of the church, you also are covenanting to be obedient already. So I don't really see that you can really make the case that has to be exclusively tied in any way to the temple attendance.
Now, I don't know if you're familiar, but there's this new Light and Truth letter that's out there that's supposed to be the answer to the CES letter. And in that particular letter here, Andrew argues for the prosperity gospel. And I think that's what Jacob will probably do as well. He talks about the socioeconomic status of members of the church. And he points to a couple statistics, including sociologist Tim Heaton, who reports in Vital Statistics on the subject of Latter-day Saints social life that members of the church have above average socioeconomic attainment. This likely includes both LDS and non-LDS countries. He also points out that Latter-day Saints have a better education and therefore better life prospects. And a religious landscape study from the Pew Research Center says that a higher percentage of Latter-day Saints are exceptionally wealthy. And the question that he poses is that why do members of the church make more money than non-religious people do? Exmo Joe, this is probably, in my opinion, going to be a bit of a harder question to answer because he has data that is going to go along with this. How do I answer this objection?
You say you don't have to answer it because the fact of the matter is that data doesn't talk about temples. It talks about Mormons, and nobody's arguing that Mormons aren't rich. Most of us know that Mormons are rich, but that's not the debate. The debate is whether or not the question of whether or not constructing temples is raising everybody out of poverty. Now, raising the community out of poverty is a very different thing than a handful of Mormons, again, benefiting from cultural nepotism, number one. And number two, benefiting from resource guarding at the end of the day. When there are jobs to be had, they go to our people first. But when there is, when there are loans to be had, they go to our people first. It'd be one thing to say that there's no proof that that's happening out there. But you do have the outcome of this data that says Mormons benefit, disproportionately in the economy, and it doesn't account for how that happens. If there's at least one example where people are giving bonuses, and like I said, there are court cases that have shown this, that people are preferred for bonuses or promotions or high paying jobs because they are Mormons, and the person who is making those hiring decisions is also Mormon. Then you have to at least account for the fact that what they're actually doing is not lifting the community out of poverty or even injecting more money into circulation. What they're effectively doing is resource guarding to the church.
I got it. Now, one way that I plan on countering those statistics here, because what is it that Mark Twain says? There's statistics, and then there's damn statistics. I can't remember the saying, but you can make statistics, confirm almost anything. But there was a study out there by Ryan Burge, who basically is the OG of religious data here, who talks about the mean household income of religious traditions, and he rank orders them all the way from the very lowest socioeconomic status here is Pentecostal Church of God. I do realize that's a little small here, but the highest income earners for mean household income is Reformed Jew, followed by Conservative Jew, then Hindu, then United Church of Christ, and way down here in the direct middle here, Joe, is Mormons. In fact, Mormons are slightly below average for the mean household income on this particular demographic. So if you're going to argue for a prosperity gospel, why is it then that Mormons are not at the very top? If we're going to argue for a prosperity gospel, then I would assume that being a Reformed Jew or a conservative Jew, therefore, is quote unquote true because they're at the top of the list. How is Jacob going to explain that the Mormons are incredibly mediocre and, in fact, according to some statistics, slightly below average? That doesn't seem congruent with a benevolent God who's supposed to be blessing them for temple attendance. That's how I intend to handle that objection.
Yeah, I don't see how he can, be blunt with you. In addition to that, you'd have to consider that you could magically change those numbers and put Mormons at the top and say, well, Mormons on average make more money than anybody else. Does that prove that they are benefiting the communities where temples are being built? Or does that prove that somebody is effectively hoarding, economic surplus? So, I mean, I don't see how that's proof of his point at all.
Okay, good. When we've got about 3 points left here, let's just go over all of the pros here for our debate prep for this time here. The next one here is financial management lessons. Church teachings reinforced in temple ordinances promote prudent financial management, living within one's means, avoiding debt, and saving for the future, tools that can lift individuals and families out of poverty. I'm sure you can play a number of different general conference addresses here where they said that you shouldn't rack up a bunch of debt and that you should be very frugal. Does that not help members with their finances?
Totally. What does it have to do with temples? And that's where again, there's got to be a day where Jacob Hansen wakes up in a cold sweat and goes, why with that? But I'm sure he won't. But if you were to make the case that the church teaching, giving some kind of financial literacy to the membership of the church is of great economic benefit to those people, and is one of the ways that the church actually is a force for good in the world. Ex-Mormon atheist Joe here, I'd have to say, yeah, that's fair. That does actually, I'd say you probably could find statistics to prove that and data to prove that. But even, I don't think you'd get much pushback on just claiming that by itself as a tautology, because I think it makes sense to most people. So, I mean, you wouldn't have to fight hard for that. But again, you'd have to show that frugality is taught in the temple. I've been to the temple many, many times, and to date, I've not seen. If I learned anything from the temple, it is opulence, not frugality. So I don't know how those two can be directly correlated, especially when you don't have to be frugal to get a temple recommend. Even, I mean, at least then you would have something to say. Well, are you frugal with your money? Are you giving the money that is in excess? Are you giving your excess wealth to benefit the poor? Well, then you'd have something. If you had a Jesus type theory, a Jesus based theory that says, look, if you have 2 coats, give one to your brother who's cold. Then you might, if that were part of the temple recommend process, well, then you'd have something. But as it is now, I mean, the best you've got is, are you, I think they still have the question that are you honest in your dealings with your fellow man or something like that? But I mean, what does that even mean? And number one, number two, are any of these people who are saying yes to that question actually paying much attention to whether or not it is true? So, yeah. I mean, but as far as like financial education, I think what little the church does on it, and I don't know how little it is. I know that we got some. I know that I got some. I've frequently mentioned this, and people, I didn't believe in privilege until I became, left of center. And then I realized one of the first things about growing up in a homogenous Mormon white community as a boy, as a cisgender, cishet male in America, is that one of my Sunday school lessons was that they pulled us and this isn't institutionalized, but it's something that does happen. I know other people have said the same thing, is that they pulled us aside and taught us the principle of compounding interest. And they taught us, one of my leaders, priesthood leaders, when I was like 14, I think it was, I was a teacher in the priesthood. He sat us down and he said, look, every paycheck you get, the first investment you make is in yourself. If you're not investing in your education, your skill set, or what have you, you don't have any hope of making more income. And while there's lots of ways to generate wealth, they all start with having, enough enough wealth, at least enough income to be able to invest. If you don't have extra income, disposable income, I should say, if you don't have disposable income, there's nothing to invest. And so it's like that, I'm like, how many people in BIPOC communities are taking kids aside at 13, 14 years old and doing that? If there are, great. But I do think that this is an example of privilege that exists inside the Mormon community, but it doesn't have anything to do with temple attendance. So I don't really see how.
What I get from your takeaway here, and I think it's an important point that I hadn't considered, is the fact that there is no temple recommend question that talks about your philanthropic efforts in order for you to go to the temple. And it does not really necessarily even ask you whether you're financially sound or whether you have debt. Now, it does ask you if you're paying all of your obligations to previous children. But as far as, the temple being something that only people who are helping others can get into, that's not necessarily the case. Now, a couple last points here. The philanthropic efforts inspired by temples. Many members are inspired by temple teachings to engage in charitable acts and philanthropy. This often includes creating or contributing to programs that help alleviate poverty both locally and globally. Joe, could it not be argued that temples are an inspiration and that just their mere presence makes me want to help others, and therefore they are fighting poverty?
Yeah, show the work. I mean, where's the paper? I can point to a temple and make the exact opposite argument and say what this shows us is that everybody in the community should see, if you give money to the church, instead of building soup kitchens, it's going to build big, opulent, magnificent marble and granite edifices for Mormons to go and hang out and have a respite from the world that isn't available to people who aren't giving 10% of their income to the church. And I would say maybe that's what it's inspiring us to believe, is that if you join that church, they're going to take your money and they're going to spend it on themselves and on the organization's real estate wealth. So it's like, I'm not saying that that's what necessarily has to happen, and that is necessarily true. I'm just saying that if you have the same amount of data, which is none, for those two arguments, they're both valid.
Okay, I got it. Now, a couple last ones here. The focus on family stability. Temples emphasize eternal family relationships, which can motivate individuals to prioritize stable, supporting eternal families. Financial stability within these families is often seen as a key to overcoming poverty, with temple teachings reinforcing these values. And I think it's a demonstrable fact that if you're in a stable family, that you will have better life outcomes, you'll be happier, you'll have more money, your household will just be more successful than if you live a chaotic life. And I don't know this for certainty, but I think that households where people are together make more money than just single people on their own. I don't know that for certainty, but I believe that is the case. That's definitely something that I need to research. What are your thoughts on that one?
Yeah, I think that you'll find that there are. I mean, and I'll help you with that if I can. But yeah, there's definitely research that shows that two-parent households, children are more likely to graduate from high school, more
Yeah.
likely to get to college, etc.
Right.
Less likely to have teen pregnancies. We'll not discuss how that happens, but okay. But you look at that, and again, you have to tie that to temple attendance, and that these are sealed in the temple families. Or at least if you could tie it to the law of chastity, it says, well, to say, well, one of the covenants, and this is something that Jacob has kind of opened the kimono to reveal to us, that it's the covenants you make in the temple that are the reason why it's an economic boon. Okay, one of those is the law of chastity, under which you're more likely to have people, which you have to be abiding with in order to go to the temple, to get a recommend to go to the temple. Okay, there you've got something. The problem that you're going to have is making those statistics support temple sealed families and not non-temple sealed families within the church. Plus, you're going to have to consider that the impact that is having on the community overall. If the church actually does have that benefit for communities, you got to consider that people who aren't paying tithing can't go to the temple and get sealed and have their eternal family and covenant to abide by the law of chastity. People who are LGBTQIA can't marry the people that they fall in love with. People who are polygamous can't go and marry people from, even though that is a principle of Mormonism that dates all the way back to Joseph Smith. And certainly people who are polyam, people who are, ethical non-monogamous aren't, and consider that all of those are family structures where, according to that data, people would also benefit. So not only do they not need the temple in order to get the benefit of that same economic driver, but in fact, they don't need the church. And in some cases, they're better off without the church, because at least in the case of LGBTQIA people, at least then they can live in that family relationship where they raise children and where those children are able to benefit from having more than one parent.
What about the argument that temples increase the property values associated with the area? Now, I've heard, like, for instance, when the Draper Temple went into Salt Lake County, that particular area, the property values went up a significant amount, maybe 5-10%, maybe even 15%. And I've heard the temples really have an impact on the areas immediately surrounding them. Is that not a good argument for the benefits economically of temples in neighborhoods?
Sure, but to whom? I mean, the problem that he's going to have, that Jacob Hansen is going to have in that case, is proving that is an economic support for the community, and not that it is a gentrification. In other words, you have, when the church purchases property, how much due diligence are they making into the question of how is this affecting BIPOC communities, BIPOC people? Are people being displaced from their traditional communities where the majority of the economic benefit, or at least a significant amount of the economic benefit, is Main Street businesses? It's businesses, people, for us, by us businesses, if you will, by Black, Indigenous, Hispanic communities, marginalized communities anyway. And are those people being displaced when the church moves in? Now, you could say, well, the church buys, a city block here, that's it. But is it? That's the question. One of the oldest criticisms of the temple building program is how the church invests in commercial real estate in the surrounding area, and how either church leaders or people connected to church leadership in the home construction industry are buying out residential areas. The church, suddenly members moving into the area suddenly start going to meetings where they start arguing for redistricting and rezoning of areas so that the temple can go in there, more commercial benefits and interest can go in there. And then you're looking at the exact opposite of what Jacob's trying to argue here. In that reality, the church is in fact profiting off of the displacement of marginalized communities, rather than investing in those marginalized communities and lifting them out of poverty.
Well, what I would argue, I understand the point here, but what I've come to find out when covering the Mormon News Roundup is that the church almost exclusively puts temples into high income areas already. They're almost never in the inner city. Salt Lake City is one of the few places that is an exception, but the Fairview Temple in McKinney, that's an exclusive neighborhood. Even in Cody, Wyoming, it's outside of the normal area. The Heber Valley Temple, which is going to go in. These are high income population areas. So I don't think that there's going to be a lot of gentrification that happens in this particular aspect. So I'm not sure that that argument is really probably the best. That's my humble estimation. Now, the last point here that we're going to come in, you put this in here, temples as an indication of church growth. You put in a couple of things here. What are your thoughts here? This is our last point here on the pro side. Maybe another time we can get the con side. But what's your last thoughts here on what you wrote about temples as an indication?
I mean, I just put down that because I was putting down notes from things I was learning from other arguments or other articles and things like that. I actually think the miraculous protection against natural disasters is probably the more interesting point out of there. I was as I was listening to church materials or watching church materials about about the benefits in communities, they went back to these old stories about, oh, well, when there was a natural disaster and, a tornado or a flood or what have you, the temple was one of the properties that was spared. So you could make the argument, I guess, and rather circumstantial to say, well, where the church builds a temple, there is at least some protection against natural disaster. It just unfortunately becomes a hard thing to explain why it is that Moroni dropped his trumpet on the Salt Lake Temple, why it is that at least 2 temples are falling into their basements, how many temples have been struck by lightning in Utah alone, so I think that'd make a pretty poor case. Another one, though, since we're just wrapping this up, that I think he may make, and it may be that we are more clever than Jacob is where the church, it may be that the church's for-profit businesses and investments in an area where a temple goes in actually may be a sign of its economic protection of the area, because once the church has investments in the area, then it has a motive to make sure that the economy in that area flourishes. I think maybe you'd have a hard time proving that, I think, but if you could prove it, that may be one of the better cases he could make.
Oh, that's true. At least in Salt Lake City, the church bought the City Creek, or helped develop the City Creek Mall project, which was $1.4 billion. And they did that in order to basically solidify because of the temple's location and church headquarters. Now, I'm not aware of any other temples that the church has shelled out a lot of money around that, but it's always possible that they did. But if it were the case that you could prove that when a church puts in a temple, that it invests in the local community, either in development or in real estate or in other ways, I think that's a good argument. I just haven't seen the evidence for that except for in Salt Lake City. So that's just something that'll keep my eye out for. But I think we covered most of the pros here. And I'm really grateful that I posted this out to YouTube, because in the comment section, and I've done a couple of live streams now on this, people are crowdsourcing the information on this for me to be able to understand both sides of the argument, because a debate is all about the best arguments. I want the best argument to win. I want to be educated on this, and shame on me if I can't prove my ideas and demonstrate them with evidence. Then I deserve to lose. And the people out there in the Mormon News Roundup land are helping me to shape my ideas and are helping me see around corners and making me smarter. And I really appreciate that. You're definitely one of those. We're going to review another time, Joe. We're going to go through the pros, and I've got a lot of really, really juicy information. There's been a couple of dissertations, there's been a couple of studies. There's a couple of fascinating things out there that give absolutely crushing arguments on the fact that Mormon temples do not have any effect whatsoever on poverty. In fact, there may be an inverse relationship. We're going to cover that on another time. And you also managed to offer to play Jacob in a mock debate with me. How about that?
I'm into it, man. I did. I've even been practicing. I've even been practicing my Jacob. It's going to be interesting. It's basically an extra whiny Tucker Carlson, but I mean, we'll have to experiment.
That's perfect. Okay. Really, Exmo Joe, thanks so much. Hellfire Agency, go check it out. The Korihor argument, very interesting, but Korihor was right. We'll have to talk a little bit more about that later, especially the fact the Korihor recanted. How can he be right if he recanted? We'll save that as a cliffhanger for our next episode. Joe, thanks so much for coming on the Mormon News Roundup.
Thank you very much for having me. Thank you.